The camera opens not on roaring engines or gleaming chrome, but on silence, the kind that settles after a family implodes. In a dim workshop once filled with sparks and shouting, Paul Teutul Jr. stands alone. Surrounded by machines he no longer touches and memories he cannot escape. Fame had promised legacy, brotherhood, and purpose. Instead, it delivered public humiliation, private wounds, and a very public fracture that millions watched unfold like entertainment. America cheered as the Teutuls built motorcycles that looked like art, but no one saw the cost paid behind closed doors. A son desperate for approval, a father consumed by control, a family brand built on conflict instead of healing. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the damage did not. This is not just the story of a reality TV star. It is the story of a man crushed between loyalty and survival, between blood and freedom. How does someone rise from a name that nearly destroyed him? And when the world knows your pain as spectacle, is redemption even possible? Before the roar of engines and the glare of television lights, there was a quieter sound shaping Paul Teutul Jr.'s inner world. The sharp rise and fall of a father's voice echoing through rooms that never felt safe for long. His childhood home was alive with motion and noise, yet emotionally unstable, a place where affection arrived unpredictably and vanished just as fast. Love was not offered freely. It was earned, withdrawn, and weaponized. From an early age, Paul Jr. learned that approval depended on compliance, that silence could be safer than honesty, and that admiration often came wrapped in fear. His father's presence dominated every space, filling rooms even when he was absent. Authority was absolute, and emotional vulnerability was treated as weakness. Paul Jr. watched carefully, measuring each word and movement, developing an instinct for survival rather than connection. Even moments that appeared warm on the surface carried an undercurrent of tension, like a storm waiting for permission to break. Laughter never lingered long before it was interrupted by criticism or control. In that environment, creativity became both sanctuary and threat. Drawing, building, imagining. These were the places where Paul Jr. felt momentarily free, able to shape something that belonged solely to him. Yet even these outlets carried risk. Expression invited judgment. Passion invited scrutiny. Each creative impulse came paired with a quiet fear of rejection, teaching him to celebrate privately and brace publicly. He learned to work harder than necessary, to over-deliver, to anticipate disappointment before it arrived. As the years passed, admiration for his father tangled painfully with resentment. Paul Jr. wanted approval more than independence, validation more than peace. He internalized the belief that love had to be earned through performance, that failure meant abandonment. That belief sank deep, embedding itself into his sense of self. Even as his confidence grew outwardly, insecurity tightened inwardly, unseen and unnamed. The house itself felt complicit, walls absorbing arguments, doors closing too loudly, silence stretching uncomfortably long after conflict ended. There were no conversations about feelings, no space for repair. Only forward motion, unresolved and heavy. Each unresolved moment stacked upon the last, forming an emotional weight Paul Jr. carried without realizing its shape. By the time adolescence arrived, the fracture was no longer forming, it was set. The wound had become familiar, almost invisible through repetition. What looked like resilience was often just endurance. What appeared to be ambition was driven by fear. And though no cameras were present yet, the conditions for public collapse were already in place. The world would one day mistake this tension for entertainment. But long before millions watched, a boy had already learned how to survive volatility, and how deeply it could scar him. When American Chopper burst into households across the nation, it brought more than motorcycles. It brought a stage, a mirror reflecting the fractures Paul Jr. had carried in silence for decades. The cameras captured sparks flying from welding torches, the sleek chrome of a finished build, the awe of fans. But behind every triumphant reveal, tension coiled like a silent predator. The workshop became both arena and prison, a place where talent collided with unresolved wounds, where every handshake, every glance, carried the weight of unspoken history. Paul Jr. was a natural, meticulous, bold, visionary. His designs drew attention, admiration, and respect. Yet each accolade deepened the pressure. Every compliment was tinged with fear. Would his father approve? Would praise turn into scrutiny? Authority clashed with independence daily. Arguments erupted over blueprints, deadlines, and creative choices. But beneath the surface, the real battleground was emotional. Father and son reenacted decades of unhealed pain, each conflict magnified by the public eye, each shouting match a rehearsal for past wounds. The cameras captured the drama, audiences relishing the tension, mistaking it for performance, never knowing the stakes were deeply personal. When Paul Jr. slammed down a wrench or stormed from the room, it was not for show. It was the release of a lifetime of pressure building invisibly. Recognition brought validation but also isolation. The more he succeeded professionally, the more trapped he felt emotionally. Fans cheered for the fight, yet the fight had no winner. Only lingering resentment, humiliation, and exhaustion. Even as the company thrived, Paul Jr.'s inner world contracted. The joy of creation was entwined with dread. Each bike became a monument to both talent and torment. Late nights in the shop offered fleeting solace, but the walls seemed to echo judgment rather than applause. He wrestled with conflicting feelings. Love and resentment for a father whose approval he craved, pride and shame over his own ambition. Every decision carried the weight of legacy and the threat of familial rupture. In private moments, Paul Jr. wrestled with the paradox of success. Fame brought admiration, yet it magnified every flaw, every misstep. Friends and colleagues offered support, yet none could bridge the emotional chasm created over decades. His father's shadow loomed larger than ever, shaping behavior, dictating tone, defining boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. And yet, for all the accolades and public acclaim, the fracture within remained unhealed. The workshop had become a theater of conflict, fame a magnifying glass, and every project a test of endurance, loyalty, and sanity. The more the world watched, the less Paul Jr. recognized himself, caught between admiration and fear, ambition and survival, love and resentment. The firing was sudden, public, and unforgiving. Paul Teutul Jr., once the rising star of a nationally beloved family brand, found himself cast out not just from the company he helped build, but from the family he had always tried to please. The cameras that had once chronicled his creativity now seemed to spotlight his erasure, as if the world itself had agreed that his presence was no longer required. Headlines blared betrayal. Fans speculated endlessly. Every gesture, every whispered word, every subtle glance became evidence in a court of public opinion. And yet, behind the spectacle, the emotional collapse was silent, private, and relentless. Suddenly, the man who had felt seen for the first time through his work felt invisible. Legal threats replaced family dinners. Cold contracts replaced conversations that never had been warm. Paul Jr. threw himself into launching his own venture, building bikes in new spaces, trying to recreate the sense of purpose that had been ripped away. But success in the public eye felt hollow. The applause could not reach into the private chambers of loneliness that closed in around him. Nights became long and quiet, punctuated by the echo of voices no longer there and the unshakable sense of abandonment. Even as his professional identity began to emerge anew, the psychological wounds deepened. Every decision carried the weight of scrutiny. Every interaction with his father, however brief, was tinged with the bitter residue of rejection. Guilt mingled with anger, fear with frustration, forming an emotional fog through which he struggled to navigate. Trust, once instinctive, now required calculation. The world saw a confident entrepreneur, a skilled craftsman, a television personality. But inside, Paul Jr. wrestled with a relentless inner monologue. Who am I if not the son in the shop, if not the rising talent of American Chopper? The paradox of visibility and isolation became painfully clear. He could be everywhere at once, recognized by millions, yet unseen by those whose approval had once defined him. Each build became a testament to endurance and defiance, yet also a reminder of what had been lost. The machines carried echoes of past arguments, unresolved tensions, and a longing for reconciliation that may never come. The excitement of creation was now inseparable from anxiety, and every new project risked reopening old wounds. Even in moments of triumph, doubt gnawed at him. Every design, every negotiation, every public appearance became a psychological battlefield. The exile was no longer simply professional, it was existential. The foundation of identity, once shared with a family and a brand, now felt fractured and fragile. Success, in its harshest sense, did not shield Paul Teutul Jr. from the internal storm gathering in the shadows. On the outside, he built motorcycles that drew acclaim, launched businesses that defied expectation, and maintained a public persona that radiated control and precision. But behind closed doors, the weight of years of unresolved trauma pressed heavily upon him. Anxiety had become a constant companion, tightening its grip around his chest, whispering that nothing he achieved could ever undo the fractures of the past. The same patterns he had sought to escape, anger, rigidity, fear of rejection, now echoed in his own behavior, mirrored back to him in quiet, devastating moments of realization. Even intimate relationships strained under this invisible pressure. Friends and colleagues noted the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze could harden in seconds, the occasional silence that stretched unbearably long after a conversation. Trust, already difficult to extend, became nearly impossible. He found himself walking on a psychological tightrope, balancing ambition against the fear that every misstep would unravel the fragile sense of stability he had managed to reclaim. The very traits that had fueled his creative genius, perfectionism, relentless drive, and fierce independence, now threatened to consume him. Within the confines of his private spaces, Paul Jr. confronted a truth he had long avoided. Success was not enough. The recognition of fans, the approval of colleagues, even the achievements he had fought so hard to attain, could not fill the void left by fractured family bonds and years of suppressed emotions. Nights became the hardest part, quiet, long, and unforgiving. The workshop, once a sanctuary, sometimes felt like a cage. Shadows of arguments, old criticisms, and lost opportunities lingered in corners, whispering reminders of failure that he could not silence. The collapse was not dramatic or sudden. It was slow, creeping, a quiet erosion of self that went unnoticed by the outside world. Moments of despair were punctuated by bursts of creativity, yet even those flashes of brilliance carried undertones of desperation. A need to prove worth, to justify existence, to assert identity. Each victory in the shop was tempered by a private reckoning, an awareness that the man he had become was still entangled in the patterns he had vowed to escape. In the quiet aftermath of collapse, Paul Teutul Jr. began the slow, painstaking work of reclaiming himself. The cameras no longer circled, the public no longer demanded drama, and the roar of approval had faded into a fragile stillness. It was in this silence that true reflection could begin, a reflection not for the world to witness but for the man himself. Healing was not cinematic. It was uneven, jagged, and often painfully solitary. Each day presented choices between old habits and new patterns, between anger and acceptance, between survival and freedom. Through creativity, he discovered a form of therapy. Each bike he designed, each blueprint he drafted, became a meditation, a conversation with the part of himself that had been silenced for so long. Fatherhood, friendships, and mentorship offered mirrors of empathy he had rarely experienced. The Teutul name, once synonymous with conflict and spectacle, gradually transformed into something more complex. A story of endurance, adaptation, and survival. Paul Jr. began to see that legacy was not simply inherited. It could be consciously reshaped, rebuilt with intention rather than obligation. Yet the journey was neither neat nor complete. Wounds that had festered for decades did not vanish. Memories of betrayal and humiliation lingered, sometimes surfacing unexpectedly, sometimes coloring interactions with caution or hesitation. Self-forgiveness was a daily practice, and humility became both shield and compass. The work of defining oneself beyond public perception demanded vigilance, honesty, and relentless self-reflection. The transformation was quiet, but profound. triumph was no longer measured by media attention or approval. It was measured in moments of internal alignment, in the ability to face his past without letting it dictate his present. The legacy he now cultivated was not about fame or spectacle. It was about resilience, authenticity, and a deliberate choice to break cycles that had haunted generations. In this new framework, Paul Jr. could embrace the freedom of being himself, flawed, scarred, and yet enduring.